I arrived at my wife's mother's house without telling anyone after my work trip. I found my son shivering on the street in a t-shirt and shorts in 5 degrees Fahrenheit weather. Inside the house, the whole family was eating turkey at the holiday table. I kicked the door open and said 6 words. Their faces went white. The cabin pressure dropped as we descended into Chicago O'Hare, and I felt that familiar knot in my stomach that had nothing to do with turbulence. I'd been running on fumes and black coffee for the past 72 hours, bouncing between glass conference rooms in Manhattan, where Series B investors grilled me about LexForge's machine learning algorithms like they were personally offended by artificial intelligence. The due diligence process had been brutal. Spreadsheets dissecting our SaaS metrics, product roadmaps scrutinized down to the last feature update, and a particularly tense discussion about a potential acquisition that had our boards sweating through their Tom Ford suits. Marcus Hale, they call me, CEO and founder of LexForge, the legal tech startup that's supposedly revolutionizing how law firms handle contract compliance. We use AI to catch the stuff that overworked associates miss at 2 a.m., the liability clauses that could sink a deal, the regulatory gaps that make general counsels wake up in cold sweats. It's a damn good product, if I do say so myself, and the venture capital guys seem to agree. Our series of funding had come in hot, and now we were closing Series B with enough runway to scale nationally. Not bad for a guy who started coding legal algorithms in his garage 3 years ago. But right now, all that corporate success felt like monopoly money compared to what was waiting for me at home. Or what I thought was waiting for me. The plane touched down at 4:47 a.m. according to my phone, which had been buzzing with Slack notifications I'd been ignoring since we hit cruising altitude. My general counsel Priya Shah had sent me a deck about compliance updates. My CFO Luis had forwarded some portfolio diversification recommendations, and somewhere in the digital noise was a text from Aurora, my wife, saying they'd moved Thanksgiving dinner to her mother's place to keep things simple. Simple. Right. Nothing about the Kingsley family had ever been simple. I grabbed my carry-on from the overhead bin, nodding to the flight attendant who'd been serving me whiskey neat for the past 4 hours. The jetway smelled like industrial carpet and recycled air, a sharp contrast to the leather and mahogany of the Manhattan offices I'd just left. In the terminal, I passed a Starbucks that wasn't open yet, and a Hudson News selling magazines with headlines about market volatility and tech IPOs. The usual suspects. My Tesla was waiting in the parking garage where I'd left it, looking sleek and out of place next to the salt-stained SUVs and pickup trucks. Chicago winters are unforgiving, especially to guys like me who spend most of their time in climate-controlled boardrooms discussing acquisition strategies and equity stakes. I tossed my briefcase in the passenger seat, hung up my Tom Ford suit jacket, a splurge from when we closed our first major client, a white shoe law firm that paid us 7 figures to overhaul their contract review process, and grabbed the down coat I kept in the trunk for emergencies. The dashboard read 5 degrees Fahrenheit as I pulled out of O'Hare, which was brutal even by Chicago standards. The roads were mostly empty except for the occasional snow plow and a few early shift workers heading to jobs that actually mattered. I took the Kennedy to the Edens, muscle memory guiding me toward Winnetka, where the Kingsleys lived in the kind of house that screamed, "We have generational wealth, and we're not afraid to use it." Maureen Kingsley, my mother-in-law, ran her family like a Fortune 500 company with herself as the perpetual CEO. Every holiday was a board meeting where the metrics were appearances and social positioning. The woman could turn a simple dinner into a networking event, complete with strategic seating arrangements and conversations that felt like hostile takeover negotiations. She'd hired a $48,000 venue for her anniversary party last year. Yes, 48 grand for one night, and had spent the entire evening making sure everyone knew it. The Upper West Side penthouse photos from their Manhattan visits always made it onto her Instagram within hours, along with carefully curated shots of whatever top-shelf whiskey they were pouring. Usually Macallan 25, because subtlety was never the Kingsley way. Gerald Kingsley, her husband, was cut from the same cloth, but with a different pattern. He'd built a logistics empire in the Midwest, buying up smaller companies and optimizing them until they either thrived or died. He talked like a private equity playbook, dropping terms like synergy and value creation into casual conversation about the weather. The guy could make ordering pizza sound like a leveraged buyout. And then there was Aurora, caught somewhere between the family she'd grown up in and the life we'd built together. She'd gone to Northwestern Law, worked at a boutique firm doing corporate law, and had the kind of sharp intellect that could dissect a merger agreement like a surgeon. But around her parents, she turned into this version of herself that I barely recognized. Agreeable, deferential, always trying to manage everyone else's expectations. I'd been looking forward to seeing her and Theo, our 8-year-old son who had inherited Aurora's brains and, unfortunately, my stubborn streak. The kid was brilliant, already asking questions about coding and showing an interest in how our legal tech platform worked. He'd sit in my home office sometimes, watching me debug algorithms and asking if computers could really understand law better than people. The GPS guided me off the highway and through the winding roads of Winnetka, past houses that looked like investment portfolios made manifest. This was old money country, where the driveways were longer than most people's mortgages and the property taxes could fund a small startup. I'd never felt entirely comfortable here, even after LexForge started generating serious revenue. There's a difference between earned wealth and inherited wealth, and the Kingsleys made sure everyone knew which category they fell into. As I turned onto Birchwood Lane, I could see warm lights spilling from the windows of the Kingsley house. Cars lined the circular driveway, BMWs, Mercedes, a Porsche that probably belonged to Aurora's cousin who worked in private equity. The kind of automotive lineup you'd see at a country club board meeting. I could hear faint laughter carrying through the cold air, the sound of a family gathering in full swing. I didn't text anyone to announce my arrival. Part of me wanted to surprise them, to walk in and see Aurora's face light up when she realized I'd made it back in time for dinner. But another part of me, the part that had spent 3 years building a company from nothing and learning to read between the lines of investor conversations, wanted to see things as they really were before anyone had a chance to manage the message. The snow was coming down harder now, cutting across my headlights in diagonal lines that made the world look like a glitched video feed. I pulled into the driveway behind a silver Lexus, probably belonged to Aurora's aunt, the one who worked in wealth management and always had opinions about our portfolio allocation. That's when I saw him. My son Theo, sitting on the curb in front of the house, wearing nothing but a t-shirt and shorts, his arms wrapped around his ribs like he was trying to hold himself together. Even from inside the car, I could see him shaking. The panic hit me like a systems crash. Everything else just stopped. The Series B funding, the board meetings, the acquisition talks, all of it became background noise. I killed the engine and moved fast, grabbing my coat and an emergency blanket from the trunk, muscle memory from camping trips and Boy Scout training kicking in. The cold hit me like a physical force when I stepped out of the Tesla. 5 degrees Fahrenheit with a wind chill that made it feel like Antarctica. And my son had been sitting out here in summer clothes while his entire extended family ate turkey and made small talk about the markets. This wasn't discipline. This wasn't even close to reasonable. This was endangerment, plain and simple. In my head, all the compliance protocols from work started firing at once. Assess severity, identify exposure, implement immediate mitigation strategies. But this wasn't a legal brief or a risk assessment. This was my kid, and someone was going to answer for it. The distance between my Tesla and my son couldn't have been more than 20 feet, but it felt like crossing an entire portfolio of bad investments. Each step through the snow was like watching our family's net worth tank in real time. Except this wasn't about money. This was about something infinitely more valuable that someone had just decided to gamble with. Theo looked up when he heard my footsteps crunching through the snow, and Jesus Christ, the relief in his eyes nearly broke me. His lips were blue, actually blue, like some kind of grotesque corporate branding experiment gone wrong. His face was pale as a quarterly report that nobody wants to read, and he was shaking so hard I thought he might vibrate right off the curb. Dad, his voice came out cracked and small, like a startup pitching to investors who've already made up their minds. You came back. I dropped to my knees in the snow, not giving a damn about my pants or the cold seeping through the fabric. My down coat came off in one motion, and I wrapped it around his shoulders like I was protecting the most valuable asset in my entire portfolio. Which, let's be honest, he was. How long, buddy? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady while my brain ran through every child endangerment statute I'd ever reviewed for clients. How long have you been out here? His teeth were chattering so hard, he could barely get the words out. Since 11. I burned the rolls. Burn the rolls. Let that sink in for a minute. My 8-year-old son had been locked outside in 5-degree weather for over 5 hours because he made a mistake that any reasonable adult would handle with, I don't know, maybe a gentle correction and a replacement badge from the grocery store. But apparently, the Kingsley family had decided that near hypothermia was the appropriate market response to culinary inexperience. I scooped him up and carried him to the Tesla, his body feeling way too light and way too cold against my chest. The car's heating system kicked in immediately. Thank God for German engineering and electric vehicle innovation, and I cranked it up to full blast. The interior temperature readings started climbing from 32 degrees Fahrenheit, which meant the car had been cold enough to freeze water. My son had been sitting outside in conditions that were literally freezing. I kept an emergency kit in the trunk because, unlike some people, I actually planned for contingencies. Thermal blankets, water, basic first aid supplies. The kind of risk management that any competent CEO implements for business travel. I grabbed a space blanket and wrapped it around Theo's legs, the silver material crinkling like aluminum foil as I tucked it around him. Okay, let's do a quick systems check, I said, falling back into the kind of methodical assessment that had served me well in board meetings and crisis management scenarios. I examined his fingers, checking for the telltale white patches of frostnip that could escalate to full-blown frostbite if left untreated. His fingertips were pale and cold, but the circulation seemed intact. His ears were red and obviously painful, but I didn't see any of the waxy, grayish coloring that would indicate serious tissue damage. Still, this was well beyond the threshold of what any reasonable person would consider safe. In the corporate world, we have risk assessment matrices that would flag this scenario as immediate intervention required. If I'd subjected an employee to these conditions, I'd be facing lawsuits that would make our series B funding look like lunch money. Dad, I'm sorry about the rolls, Theo whispered, and that's when the fury really started building in my chest. Not the explosive, uncontrolled kind that leads to bad decisions and worse outcomes, but the cold, calculated anger that drives successful hostile takeovers and regulatory compliance investigations. You have nothing to be sorry for, I told him, checking his core temperature by feeling his chest and abdomen through the blankets. Still cold, but warming up. Burning food is not a crime. Hell, I burned an entire Thanksgiving turkey when I was 12, and your grandmother just ordered pizza and told everyone it was a learning experience. My grandmother, not theirs. The Kingsleys apparently operated under a different set of quality control standards. I pulled out my phone and started documenting everything with the same precision I used for due diligence reports. Photos of Theo's condition, screenshots of the weather app showing current temperature and wind chill, timestamps for when I found him and when we got him into the car. If this situation escalated, and my gut told me it was going to, I wanted an evidentiary record that would hold up under scrutiny. Dad, are we going inside? Theo asked, his voice getting stronger as the car's heating system worked its magic. The interior temperature had climbed to 75 degrees Fahrenheit, and some color was starting to return to his cheeks. I looked toward the house, where warm light continued to spill from every window. Through the front window, I could see people moving around in what looked like the dining room, probably finishing dessert, discussing their investment strategies and vacation homes while my son had been slowly freezing to death on their curb. Yeah, we're going inside, I said, but not for the reasons they might expect. I opened the glove compartment and pulled out the executive legal pad I kept there for jotting down contract notes during calls. I'd learned early in my legal tech career that documentation was everything. You could have the best algorithms in the world, but if you couldn't prove chain of custody and maintain detailed records, your evidence was worthless in court. I wrote down everything: arrival time, Theo's condition, his explanation about the rolls, the duration of exposure, ambient temperature, and his current status. I included details about the locked front door, the family gathering inside, and the complete absence of any adult checking on a child who'd been outside for hours in potentially lethal weather conditions. This wasn't just about family dynamics anymore. This was about negligence that crossed legal boundaries, and I was going to treat it with the same systematic approach I used for corporate investigations. Thorough documentation, careful evidence preservation, and strategic planning for multiple potential outcomes. "Dad, you look really mad," Theo observed, studying my face with the kind of perceptive intelligence that reminded me why I loved this kid so much. "I am really mad," I admitted. "But not at you. Never at you." I helped him out of the car, keeping the emergency blanket wrapped around his shoulders and my arm around his back for additional warmth and support. The snow crunched under our feet as we walked toward the front door, and I could hear the faint sound of conversation and laughter from inside. Piano music, probably Aurora's cousin showing off again with some classical piece that was supposed to demonstrate cultural sophistication. The front door was locked, which I'd expected. I rang the doorbell and waited, listening to the sounds of a happy family gathering while holding my half-frozen son against my side. Footsteps approached from inside, and I heard someone fiddling with the deadbolt. The door opened to reveal Gerald Kingsley himself, looking like he'd stepped out of a private equity Christmas card. Navy blazer, perfectly pressed khakis, a glass of what was probably that damn Macallan 25 in his hand. His face registered surprise when he saw me, then confusion when he noticed Theo wrapped in blankets. "Marcus, we weren't expecting you until tomorrow. Aurora said your board meetings ran long." I looked him dead in the eye, my son shivering beside me despite the blankets, and felt that cold fury crystallize into something sharp and focused. "We need to talk," I said. "Right now." Gerald stepped aside with the kind of calculated politeness that screams damage control, but I could see the wheels spinning behind his eyes like a CFO, trying to figure out how to spin a quarterly loss. The warm air from inside the house hit us like walking into a different universe. Turkey, cinnamon, some kind of expensive candle that probably cost more than most people's monthly car payments, and the unmistakable sound of a family gathering that had been going perfectly fine without us. Come in, Gerald said, his voice carrying that practice charm he probably used in board meetings when he was about to restructure someone's entire department out of existence. "Aurora will be so surprised. We saved you both plates." "Saved us plates." Right. While my son was developing hypothermia on their front lawn, they'd been thoughtful enough to set aside some cranberry sauce and stuffing. The corporate hospitality was truly overwhelming. I guided Theo through the foyer, past the marble table with the fresh orchid arrangement that probably cost more than most people's weekly grocery budget. The house smelled like wealth, that particular blend of expensive cleaning products, fresh flowers, and the kind of furniture polish that only comes with pieces that have actual provenance. Everything was perfectly curated, from the artwork on the walls to the seasonal decorations that looked like they'd been installed by a professional staging company. The dining room opened up before us like a scene from some upscale magazine spread. The table was set with what I recognized as Maureen's wedding china, the spode pattern she'd inherited from her mother and trotted out for occasions when she needed to remind everyone of the family's social status. Crystal wine glasses caught the candlelight, and the centerpiece looked like something you'd see at a $48,000 corporate event, all autumn leaves and gold accents arranged with mathematical precision. And there they all were, the Kingsley extended family in their natural habitat. Maureen sat at the head of the table like she was chairing a shareholder meeting, wearing what looked like a designer sweater that probably cost more than most people's rent. Aurora's Aunt Patricia, the wealth management advisor who always had opinions about everyone else's portfolio allocation, was gesturing with a wine glass while explaining something to Aurora's cousin David, who worked in private equity and never let anyone forget it. Aurora herself sat about halfway down the table, and when she saw us walk in, her face went through a sequence of expressions that would have been fascinating to watch if I hadn't been so furious. Surprise, relief, confusion, and then, when she really looked at Theo wrapped in emergency blankets, something that might have been horror. The conversation didn't exactly stop, but it definitely downshifted, like a Tesla switching from sport mode to eco mode. People kept talking, but their eyes were on us, trying to process the scene we just walked into. Piano music continued to drift from the living room, some Chopin piece that David's wife Emma always played when she wanted to demonstrate her conservatory training. "Marcus." Maureen rose from her throne at the head of the table, napkin in hand, wearing the kind of smile that corporate communications departments spend millions trying to perfect. "What a wonderful surprise. Though you both look like you've been through quite an adventure." An adventure. That's what she called it. My son had been locked outside in potentially lethal weather conditions for over 5 hours, and she was spinning it like we'd just returned from a fun winter activity. The audacity was actually impressive in a sociopathic sort of way. I looked around the table, taking inventory like I was conducting a hostile takeover audit. 23 people by my count, all of them clearly well-fed and warm, all of them apparently comfortable with the knowledge that an 8-year-old had been exiled to the front yard for the crime of burning some dinner rolls. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. Theo pressed closer to my side, still shivering despite the blankets and the warm house air. His lips were starting to return to a normal color, but I could feel him trembling against my ribs. The kid was exhausted, probably dehydrated, and definitely traumatized by whatever power play had led to his outdoor exile. Aurora stood up, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a sound like fingernails on a compliance violation. "Marcus, what are you? How did you? We weren't expecting you until tomorrow." "Plans changed," I said, my voice carrying the kind of controlled calm that I used in board meetings when someone had seriously fucked up and was about to find out exactly how much their mistake was going to cost. "Caught an earlier flight. Good thing, too." Gerald had followed us into the dining room, still carrying his glass of Macallan 25 like it was some kind of prop in a performance about sophisticated family dynamics. "Well, this is perfect timing," he said, launching into what sounded like a prepared statement. "We were just discussing Theo's learning opportunity about consequences and responsibility." Learning opportunity. I had to admire the corporate speak, even as it made me want to throw him through the nearest window. This was the same kind of language that private equity firms used when they fired half a company's workforce and called it right-sizing for optimal efficiency. "Is that what we're calling it?" I asked, shifting Theo so that my arm was around his shoulders, keeping him close and warm. "A learning opportunity?" The piano music stopped abruptly from the living room, and I could hear Emma's footsteps as she came to see what the sudden tension was about. The dining room felt like a boardroom where someone had just announced an unexpected audit. Everyone was suddenly very interested in their wine glasses and dessert plates. Maureen stepped forward, clearly recognizing that this situation required executive intervention. Her smile never wavered, but I could see the calculation behind her eyes, the same kind of strategic thinking that had probably helped her navigate decades of social and financial maneuvering. "Now, Marcus," she said, her voice carrying the kind of condescending warmth that made my skin crawl. "Let's not make this more dramatic than it needs to be. Theo made a mistake with dinner, and we felt it was important for him to understand the consequences of not following instructions carefully." Consequences. Instructions. She was talking about my son like he was an underperforming employee who needed corrective action. The woman had literally locked an 8-year-old outside in sub-zero weather and was discussing it like it was a reasonable management decision. I looked at Aurora, who was staring at her place setting like it contained the secrets of the universe. Her face had gone pale, and I could see her hands shaking slightly as she gripped the back of her chair. She knew. She absolutely knew how fucked up this was, but she was frozen in the same pattern of deference to her parents that had been driving me crazy for years. The entire room was watching us now, 23 pairs of eyes like a jury waiting for closing arguments. The candlelight flickered across their faces, casting shadows that made everyone look vaguely sinister, like a board of directors about to vote on whether to destroy someone's life for quarterly profit margins. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle around me like a legal brief that was about to change everything. This wasn't just about Theo anymore. This was about what kind of family we were going to be, what kind of standards we were going to accept, and whether I was going to let these people continue to treat my son like a disposable asset in their family portfolio. I looked directly at Maureen, then let my gaze sweep across the entire table, making sure everyone could see my face and hear my words clearly. I already called Child Protective Services. 6 words. Clean, simple, and absolutely devastating. The silence that followed was like the moment after a market crash, when everyone's still processing the magnitude of what just happened and trying to figure out how much they're about to lose. The silence stretched out like a liquidity crisis, painful, unprecedented, and absolutely nobody knew how to fix it. 23 faces stared at me with expressions ranging from shock to horror to what I could only describe as quarterly earnings panic. The candlelight flickered across the designer place settings, making the whole scene look like a Renaissance painting titled The Last Supper of Generational Wealth. Gerald was the first to recover, which didn't surprise me. The guy had probably survived hostile takeovers, market crashes, and at least a few SEC investigations. He set his Macallan 25 down on the table with the kind of deliberate calm that screams, "Crisis management mode activated." "Let's not be dramatic, Marcus," he said, his voice carrying that measured tone that CFOs use when they're about to explain why the company's burning through cash faster than a Series B funding round. "I'm sure we can handle this as a family matter without involving outside agencies." Outside agencies, like Child Protective Services, was some kind of regulatory body that could be lobbied or bought off. Although, knowing Gerald's approach to business challenges, he was probably already running through his mental Rolodex of lawyers and fixers who could make this particular problem disappear. Maureen stepped forward, her smile shifting into what I recognized as full-scale damage control mode. She'd probably used this exact expression when explaining to country club friends why their last charity event had gone over budget by 40%. "We were letting Theo cool off," she said, like she was presenting a perfectly reasonable investment strategy. "Children need to understand that actions have consequences." Cool off. In 5-degree weather. For 5 hours. The euphemism was so breathtakingly tone-deaf that I almost had to admire it. This was the same kind of linguistic gymnastics that private equity firms used when they called mass layoffs workforce optimization. I pulled out my phone, and I swear to God, you could feel the collective blood pressure in the room spike. Nothing makes wealthy people more nervous than someone documenting their behavior in real time. It's like watching a compliance audit kick off. Suddenly, everyone's very concerned about their exposure. "See this?" I held up my phone, showing the timestamp on my photos of Theo's condition. 4:47 a.m. I took these pictures when I found him on your curb. Weather app shows it was 5 degrees Fahrenheit with a wind chill of -8 degrees Fahrenheit. He was wearing shorts and a t-shirt. I swiped to the next photo. "Here's the locked front door. And here's your security camera." I'm betting the footage shows exactly how long he was out there. The security camera comment hit, like insider trading allegations. Gerald's face went through several color changes, probably calculating the legal implications of having documented evidence of child endangerment stored on his own surveillance system. Nothing quite like having your own risk management protocols turn into a liability assessment. "Marcus, please," Aurora said, her voice carrying the kind of desperate calm that you hear from startup founders when their series of funding just fell through. "Not in front of everyone. Can we talk about this privately?" I looked at her, really looked at her, and felt something break inside my chest. This was the woman who could dissect a merger agreement like a forensic accountant, who'd graduated magna cum laude from Northwestern Law, who could argue constitutional law over dinner and make it sound like casual conversation. But put her in a room with her parents, and she turned into this person who prioritized appearance management over child safety. "That's exactly the point, Aurora," I said, my voice staying level despite the fury building behind my sternum. Everyone watched. Everyone sat here eating turkey while an 8-year-old was developing hypothermia 20 feet away. Patricia, the wealth management aunt, cleared her throat like she was about to deliver a portfolio recommendation. "Marcus, I think you might be overreacting. Children are more resilient than we give them credit for." Overreacting. Right. Because statistical analysis of child mortality rates in sub-zero temperatures was clearly just helicopter parenting taken to extremes. Resilient enough to survive exposure that would kill an adult? I asked. Because that's what we're talking about here. Medical-grade hypothermia. David, the private equity cousin, decided to chime in with what sounded like a prepared statement from his firm's crisis communications team. "Look, Marcus, we all want what's best for Theo. But involving government agencies seems like an unnecessary escalation that could damage everyone's interests." Everyone's interests. Like this was some kind of stakeholder management situation where we needed to balance competing priorities instead of, I don't know, maybe prioritizing the physical safety of a child. The corporate speak was making my head hurt. "You know what damages everyone's interests?" I said, pulling up the photos again. "Documented evidence of child endangerment." Which is exactly what I have here. I swiped to a screenshot I'd taken of the weather warnings. National Weather Service issued a frostbite advisory for tonight. 15 minutes of exposure in these conditions can cause permanent tissue damage. Theo was out there for over 5 hours. The room was so quiet you could hear the stock market crashing. Someone's wine glass clinked against a plate, and it sounded like a gavel in a courtroom. Emma had appeared in the doorway from the living room, still in her concert dress, looking like she'd walked into a board meeting where someone had just announced bankruptcy. Gerald tried another approach, switching from damage control to what looked like negotiation strategy. Marcus, I understand you're upset, but think about this rationally. Theo is fine. Theo is fine because I showed up. I interrupted, my voice cutting through his corporate doublespeak like a hostile takeover announcement. If I'd waited until tomorrow like you expected, we might be having a very different conversation. I could see Maureen's mind working, probably running through the same kind of risk assessment matrix that she used for her investment portfolio. Calculate exposure, identify potential losses, develop mitigation strategies. The problem was, she was treating this like a reputation management crisis instead of what it actually was, a criminal investigation waiting to happen. This is ridiculous, she said, her smile finally cracking around the edges. We're his grandparents. We love him. We would never. You locked an 8-year-old outside in sub-zero weather for 5 hours, I said, each word hitting like a line item in an indictment. Love doesn't enter into it. We're talking about criminal negligence. Aurora's cousin muttered something about family loyalty and consequences building character, but I was done listening to their focus group-tested talking points. These people were treating child endangerment like a difference of opinion about asset allocation. Here's what's going to happen, I said, shifting Theo closer to my side while I pulled up my contacts list. I'm calling our family attorney, Cal Brooks. I'm calling Dr. Nguyen to document Theo's condition. And I'm following through with CPS because this isn't a family matter anymore. It's a legal matter. The dining room felt like a boardroom where someone had just announced a federal investigation. Everyone was suddenly very interested in their dessert plates, probably running through their own exposure calculations and wondering how much this was going to cost them in legal fees and reputation damage. Gerald made one last attempt at executive authority, straightening his blazer like he was about to deliver quarterly results to disappointed shareholders. Marcus, you're making a mistake. Think about what this means for Aurora's career, for your company's reputation. Is this really the hill you want to die on? I looked at him, then at the rest of the table, then down at my son who was still shivering in my arms despite being inside for 10 minutes. The choice was so clear it felt like reading a contract with terms written in 72-point font. Yeah, I said. It is. The dining room had turned into the kind of tense standoff you see in corporate boardrooms right before someone gets escorted out by security. Everyone was frozen in their seats like they were waiting for the quarterly earnings call to officially tank their stock price. The only sound was the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking away like a countdown timer to a hostile takeover. I wasn't interested in prolonging this particular board meeting. Theo, go get your bag, I said, keeping my voice calm and controlled despite feeling like I was about to execute the most important acquisition of my career. We're leaving. Theo looked up at me with those wide brown eyes that reminded me so much of Aurora when we first met in law school. All my stuff, everything that's yours, I confirmed, positioning myself between him and the table full of people who'd just demonstrated their approach to child welfare. Take your time, buddy. I'll be right behind you. As Theo headed toward the stairs, still wrapped in my emergency blanket like a tiny refugee from a financial disaster, Maureen finally dropped the corporate hospitality act. Her voice turned sharp as a leverage buyout negotiation gone wrong. You don't make decisions here, Marcus, she said, standing up from her chair like she was calling an emergency shareholder meeting to order. This is our house, our family, our rules. I turned to look at her, and I swear I could feel my expression shift into the same mode I used when venture capitalists tried to lowball our Series B valuation. Cool, calculating, absolutely zero room for negotiation. Watch me, I said. The smile I gave her was probably the same one that made competing legal tech startups nervous during acquisition talks. Pleasant on the surface, but with enough underlying steel to cut through a compliance audit. I'd learned that particular expression from watching Gerald himself during business negotiations, actually. Funny how these things come full circle. I followed Theo upstairs, leaving behind a dining room full of people who were probably trying to figure out how to spin this disaster into something that wouldn't end up on the front page of the Chicago Tribune's business section. The second floor of the Kingsley house was all hardwood floors and family photos that looked like they'd been curated by a marketing team. Every image carefully selected to project success, stability, and generational wealth. Theo's guest room was at the end of the hall, and walking into it was like conducting a forensic audit of a failed startup. His belongings were scattered around like he'd never been allowed to fully settle in, like he was always just a temporary visitor in someone else's corporate headquarters. A few toys on the dresser, some clothes folded in a corner, his tablet charging on the nightstand. It looked like the room of a kid who'd learned not to get too comfortable. While Theo gathered his things, I pulled out my phone and started executing what I thought of as emergency protocols. First text went to Priya Shah, my general counsel, who was probably somewhere in Manhattan having a civilized post-Thanksgiving dinner that didn't involve child endangerment. Document incident. CPS notified. Prepare emergency filings. Freeze all joint discretionary cards. Priya's response came back within 30 seconds, which was why I paid her enough to afford her own Upper West Side penthouse. On it. Second text went to Cal Brooks, our family attorney, who specialized in the kind of high-net-worth domestic situations that usually involved prenups and asset protection rather than criminal negligence. Emergency custody situation developing. Need immediate consultation. Cal's reply was equally efficient, standing by. Send details. Third text went to my private banker at JP Morgan Private Bank, where we kept our liquid assets and had established various trust structures back when LexForge started generating serious revenue. This was where things got interesting from a financial firewall perspective. Execute emergency trust transfer per prenup addendum 7.3. All education funds into irrevocable structure. Effective immediately. The response was a simple confirmation code, which meant that within the next hour, a significant portion of our liquid assets would be locked into an irrevocable education trust for Theo that Aurora couldn't touch without court approval. The prenuptial agreement we'd signed had included provisions for exactly this kind of scenario, protection of assets in case of domestic instability that could affect our child's welfare. I'd learned about financial firewalls the same way I'd learned about computer security, by assuming the worst-case scenario and building systems to contain damage. In corporate terms, we were implementing crisis management protocols to protect critical assets while minimizing exposure to hostile actors. Fourth text went to our accountant, because when you're dealing with family court situations, documentation and financial transparency become crucial. Family emergency. Need all account statements and tax docs for emergency custody filing. While I was orchestrating this financial extraction, Theo was stuffing clothes into his Star Wars backpack with the kind of methodical efficiency that reminded me he was definitely my kid. No drama, no questions, just getting the job done. The resilience was both heartbreaking and impressive. "Dad, should I take my books?" he asked, holding up a stack of coding manuals and science fiction novels that were way above grade level. The kid was reading Isaac Asimov and trying to understand machine learning algorithms, while his classmates were still struggling with multiplication tables. "Take everything that's important to you," I said, helping him pack, while keeping one ear tuned to the sounds from downstairs. I could hear voices rising and falling like a contentious board meeting where everyone was trying to talk over each other. Footsteps on the stairs announced that someone was coming to check on our progress, and I wasn't surprised when Gerald appeared in the doorway. He'd shed the dinner party host persona and was now operating in full CEO crisis mode, sleeves rolled up, jaw set, ready to negotiate his way out of a public relations nightmare. "Marcus, we need to talk," he said, blocking the doorway like he was trying to prevent a hostile takeover from accessing the building. Man to man, business to business. I straightened up from helping Theo pack, and I could feel my expression shift into the same mode I used during contentious contract negotiations. Business to business? I repeated, "Is that what we're calling child endangerment now?" Gerald stepped into the room, lowering his voice like he was sharing insider trading information. "Look, I understand you're upset. But think about the bigger picture here. Aurora's career at the firm, your company's reputation, the family's standing in the community. Do you really want to destroy all of that over a misunderstanding?" "A misunderstanding. Right. like accidentally shorting your own stock instead of buying it, like confusing a merger with an acquisition, like mistaking child abuse for appropriate discipline. Here's the bigger picture, Gerald, I said, my voice carrying the kind of controlled fury that made opposing counsel nervous during depositions. Your family locked my son outside in potentially lethal weather conditions for 5 hours. That's not a misunderstanding. That's criminal negligence. He tried to move closer, probably thinking he could use physical presence the way he used market positioning in business deals. You're going to regret this, Marcus. You think you're protecting Theo, but you're about to destroy his mother's career and tear apart his extended family. Is that really what's best for him? I looked Gerald straight in the eye, the same way I'd looked at venture capitalists who tried to strong-arm me into accepting unfavorable terms during our series of funding. Some negotiations you walk away from, and some you burn to the ground. You know what, Gerald? File that under forward-looking statements, I said, because right now, I'm more concerned with protecting my son from people who think hypothermia is an appropriate teaching tool. His face went through several color changes, like watching a stock price crash in real time. You have no idea what you're starting here. Actually, I said, hoisting Theo's backpack and putting my arm around my son's shoulders, I know exactly what I'm starting, and I know exactly how it's going to end. We made it downstairs just as the first police cruiser pulled into the circular driveway, its blue and red lights cutting through the snow like emergency signals from a crashing startup. The timing was perfect, like when your Series B funding closes exactly when your burn rate hits critical. Through the front windows, I could see a second vehicle arriving behind the squad car, probably the CPS caseworker I'd specifically requested when I made the call from the Tesla. The dining room had transformed into something that looked like a crisis management war room. Everyone was huddled around the table in intense conversation, probably trying to coordinate their messaging like a corporate communications team dealing with a leaked SEC investigation. The elegant Thanksgiving dinner had devolved into damage control, with half-empty wine glasses and abandoned dessert plates scattered across Maureen's perfect china like evidence of a boardroom coup. Gerald was pacing by the windows, his phone pressed to his ear, probably calling his attorney or maybe his crisis management consultant. The guy who'd spent decades acquiring and dismantling companies was finally facing a hostile takeover he couldn't control through leverage and market manipulation. Aurora sat at the table looking like a CFO who'd just discovered a massive accounting discrepancy in the quarterly reports. Her face was pale as unbleached financial statements, and she kept staring at her hands like they contained the solution to a problem she didn't know how to solve. The doorbell rang with the kind of official authority that makes wealthy people immediately start calculating legal fees. I adjusted Theo's position against my side. He was still wrapped in the emergency blanket, still too quiet, still bearing the physical evidence of what these people considered appropriate family discipline. "I'll get it," I announced to the room, and the silence that followed was like the moment before a market crash when everyone's still hoping the algorithms are wrong. Officer Hart turned out to be exactly what you'd want in a cop dealing with child welfare cases. Mid-40s, calm demeanor, the kind of methodical approach that suggested extensive training in family crisis situations. She had the look of someone who'd seen enough domestic situations to know the difference between family drama and actual endangerment. Behind her stood caseworker Kara Velasquez from DCFS, carrying a tablet and wearing the kind of professional expression that suggested she'd spent her career documenting the various ways adults failed children. She looked like she could assess a family dysfunction scenario with the same precision that venture capitalists use to evaluate startup viability. "Mr. Hale?" Officer Hart asked, checking her notes like she was confirming the details of a legal brief. "You called about a child welfare concern?" "Yes," I said, stepping aside to let them into the foyer where the marble surfaces and expensive artwork suddenly felt like evidence of misplaced priorities. "This is my son, Theo. I found him outside in 5-degree weather, locked out of the house for over 5 hours. Kara immediately focused on Theo with the kind of professional assessment that reminded me of due diligence meetings. Thorough, systematic, designed to uncover problems that might not be immediately obvious. "Hey there, Theo," she said, her voice carrying the warm authority of someone who specialized in making kids feel safe. "I'm Kara. Can you tell me how you're feeling right now?" "Cold," Theo said simply, which was probably the most honest thing anyone had said in this house all night. but better now that Dad's here. Officer Hart was taking notes while Kara conducted what looked like a preliminary medical assessment. Checking Theo's color, asking about numbness or pain, the kind of systematic evaluation that any competent risk management professional would implement when assessing potential liability exposure. From the dining room came the sound of chairs scraping and urgent whispered conversations, like a board meeting where someone had just announced an FBI raid. Gerald had finished his phone call and was approaching with Aurora close behind, both of them wearing expressions that suggested their legal counsel had just explained exactly how much trouble they were potentially facing. "Officers," Gerald said, switching into full corporate crisis mode. "I think there's been a misunderstanding here. This is a family matter that got blown out of proportion." Officer Hart looked up from her notes with the kind of expression that suggested she'd heard this particular line of reasoning before. "Sir, we need to get the facts first. Can you tell me your relationship to the child?" "I'm his grandfather," Gerald replied, probably thinking that family relationships would somehow mitigate the criminal negligence aspects of the situation. "We were having Thanksgiving dinner, and Theo needed some time to think about his behavior. In sub-zero weather. For 5 hours. The euphemism was so breathtakingly inappropriate that I could see Officer Hart's expression shift into what I recognized as professional skepticism. The same look that SEC investigators got when examining obviously fraudulent financial statements. "What kind of behavior required outdoor time in these weather conditions?" Kara asked, her voice maintaining that carefully neutral tone that child welfare professionals probably learned in training. She was documenting everything on her tablet, building a case file with the same methodical approach that our legal team used for compliance audits. Maureen stepped forward, clearly recognizing that this situation required executive intervention. "He burned some dinner rolls and wasn't following kitchen safety instructions. We felt it was important for him to understand consequences." The room got quiet in a way that reminded me of board meetings when someone accidentally admits to securities violations on the record. Officer Hart and Kara exchanged a look that suggested they'd just heard enough to confirm that this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was exactly what it appeared to be. "So you locked an 8-year-old outside in 5-degree weather because he burned some food?" Officer Hart asked, her tone suggesting she was giving them one last chance to realize how insane that sounded when spoken out loud. "We didn't lock him out," Aurora said suddenly, her voice carrying the kind of desperate legal precision that suggested she was trying to create reasonable doubt where none existed. The door was just closed." "Was it unlocked?" Kara asked, looking directly at Aurora with the kind of focused attention that made it clear this was a critical question. The silence stretched out like a liquidity crisis. Aurora's face went through several expressions: lawyer, daughter, mother, before finally settling on something that looked like defeat. "No," she whispered. "It was locked." Officer Hart wrote that down with the kind of deliberate emphasis that suggested it would be appearing in official reports and potentially court documents. "And how long was the door locked with Theo outside?" Gerald tried to regain control of the narrative, probably thinking he could negotiate his way out of this like it was a hostile acquisition. "Look, it wasn't that long. Maybe an hour or two." "Since 11, Theo said quietly, his voice cutting through Gerald's attempt at damage control like insider trading evidence in a SEC investigation. "I know because I heard the clock chime." Kara checked her tablet for the time. "It's now 6:15 p.m. That's over 7 hours. The dining room had gone completely silent except for the grandfather clock that had apparently been Theo's only companion during his outdoor exile. 23 relatives who'd been perfectly comfortable eating turkey while a child developed hypothermia on their front lawn were suddenly discovering what accountability looked like when it came with badges and legal authority. "We're going to need to speak with Theo privately," Officer Hart said, her tone making it clear this wasn't a request. "And we'll need a full medical evaluation to document his condition." I looked at Maureen, whose perfectly curated Thanksgiving dinner had just turned into a criminal investigation, then at Gerald, whose crisis management skills were proving inadequate for the first time in his corporate career. "Whatever you need," I said. "We're here to cooperate fully." Because unlike some people in this room, I actually understood the difference between family loyalty and criminal negligence. And I knew which one was more important when my son's safety was on the line. By the time we made it back to my Lincoln Park condo, It was nearly midnight, and Theo was finally sleeping peacefully for what felt like the first time in months. I'd carried him up from the Tesla. He'd passed out in the heated seats during the drive home, wrapped in blankets like a tiny survivor of some corporate disaster that had finally reached resolution. My place felt like a different universe compared to the Kingsley house. Clean lines, minimal furniture, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake. The kind of space that actually felt designed for living rather than impressing potential investors at dinner parties. No marble foyers or museum-quality artwork. Just a home where an 8-year-old could burn dinner rolls without getting exiled to the frozen tundra. I'd tucked Theo into the guest bedroom that was officially his room now, watching him sleep with the kind of relief that probably felt similar to closing a successful Series B funding round after months of uncertainty. His color was back to normal, his breathing was steady, and for the first time all day, he looked like a kid instead of a refugee from someone else's power struggle. The kitchen island had become my makeshift command center, laptop open, documents spread across the granite surface like I was conducting the most important board meeting of my career. Which, in a way, I was. This wasn't just about tonight. This was about restructuring our entire family dynamic to protect the only asset that actually mattered. My phone buzzed with an incoming video call, and Priya Shah's face appeared on the screen, looking remarkably composed for someone who'd probably been fielding emergency legal texts during her own Thanksgiving dinner. Behind her, I could see what looked like her Upper West Side apartment, all exposed brick and carefully curated law books that screamed successful general counsel with equity positions in multiple startups. "Marcus," she said, her voice carrying the kind of controlled urgency that I associated with crisis management at 2 a.m. "I've got Luis on the line too. We need to talk strategy." Luis Okafor's face popped up in a second window, calling from what looked like his home office in Tribeca. Our CFO had the expression of someone who'd spent the evening running financial projections for worst-case scenarios, which was basically his default setting during any kind of corporate emergency. "Gentlemen, lady," I said, settling into the kitchen stool like I was chairing an emergency board meeting. "Thanks for jumping on this. We need to treat tonight like we're implementing crisis protocols for a hostile takeover." Priya leaned forward, already pulling up what looked like legal documents on her tablet. "First priority, protect Theo. I've drafted an emergency custody petition that we can file first thing Monday morning. Clean, straightforward, focused on documented endangerment rather than character assassination." "What's our exposure?" Luis asked, because that's what CFOs do. They quantify risk and calculate potential losses before emotions get involved. Financially, legally, operationally? I pulled up the trust documents on my laptop, the same ones I'd executed from Gerald's guest room while the dinner party imploded downstairs. I've already moved Theo's education fund into the irrevocable trust structure from the prenup. Aurora can't touch it without court approval, which means his college tuition is protected regardless of how this plays out. "Smart," Priya said, making notes on her tablet. "What about immediate liquidity? Daily expenses, medical costs, legal fees?" "I've frozen Aurora's discretionary spending privileges on all joint accounts," I replied, pulling up the banking app that showed our revised account structure. "She's got access to her salary and basic household expenses, but anything above normal monthly spend requires dual authorization. No surprises, no leveraged positions against Theo's welfare." Luis nodded approvingly. "Good risk management. What about the custody timeline? How long before we get temporary orders?" "Judge Martinelli is handling emergency family court filings this weekend," Priya said, obviously having done her homework while I was dealing with CPS interviews. "I know her from the Northwestern Alumni Network. She's tough, but fair, particularly when child welfare is involved. If we file clean documentation Monday morning, we could have temporary custody orders by Wednesday." "And Aurora?" I asked, because despite everything that had happened tonight, she was still Theo's mother and my wife. "What's her legal position?" Priya's expression shifted into the kind of careful neutrality that lawyers use when delivering bad news to clients. "Complicated. She was present during the endangerment, failed to intervene, and has a pattern of deferring to her parents' judgment even when it conflicts with child safety. Her best option is voluntary compliance with supervised visitation pending family therapy." "Which brings us to the Kingsleys," Louise said, his voice carrying the tone he used when discussing underperforming portfolio companies. What's their play here? Do they fight or do they settle? I thought about Gerald's threats in the guest room, Maureen's damage control attempts, the way they tried to spin criminal negligence as family discipline. They'll fight, I said. Gerald doesn't know how to lose gracefully, and Maureen thinks this is a reputation management crisis instead of a criminal investigation. Then we need to be prepared for scorched earth tactics, Priya warned. Character assassination, financial attacks, probably attempts to undermine Lexforge's business relationships. They'll try to make this about your fitness as a parent rather than their endangerment of Theo. Luis pulled up what looked like financial projections on his screen. Speaking of Lexforge, how do we protect the company? If this gets ugly, they might try to attack our client relationships or investor confidence. Already handled, I said, feeling the kind of strategic satisfaction that came from successful crisis planning. Our Series B closed yesterday, which means we've got 18 months of runway regardless of external pressures. Our board knows about the family situation and supports our position. And frankly, CEO protects child from endangerment isn't exactly the kind of scandal that hurts legal tech companies. What about Aurora's law firm? Priya asked. Corporate legal careers don't usually survive family court scandals. That was the part that actually hurt. Aurora had worked damn hard to build her practice, representing startups and growth companies in complex transactions. She was good at her job, respected by her clients, on track for partnership at a boutique firm that specialized in venture capital work. But her inability to prioritize child safety over family loyalty was about to cost her everything she'd built. She'll have to figure that out, I said, which sounded cold but was actually the most compassionate position I could take. I can't protect her career and Theo's safety at the same time, and I know which one matters more. Luis nodded, making notes on what looked like a project management spreadsheet. So our action items are: file emergency custody petition Monday, medical documentation from Dr. Nguyen, freeze all discretionary financial access, coordinate with CPS on ongoing investigation, and prepare for extended litigation if the Kingsleys decide to fight. One more thing, I said, reaching for the bottle of Macallan 25 that I kept on the top shelf for occasions that actually warranted 25-year-old scotch. We need to document everything. Every interaction, every conversation, every attempt at intimidation. If this goes to court, I want a paper trail that would make SEC investigators proud. I poured 3 fingers of whiskey into a crystal tumbler, the amber liquid catching the kitchen lights like liquid gold. The scotch had been a gift from our Series A lead investor, saved for celebrating major milestones. Protecting my son from hypothermia seemed like exactly the kind of milestone worth commemorating. To restructuring, I said, raising the glass toward the laptop screen where my legal and financial team were working through the night to protect the most important asset in my portfolio. To restructuring, Priya and Luis replied in unison, probably toasting with whatever they had handy in their respective apartments. I took a sip of the Macallan, feeling the warmth spread through my chest like the satisfaction of closing a deal that everyone said was impossible. Down the hall, Theo was sleeping safely in his own bed, in his own home, protected by legal and financial firewalls that would keep him safe regardless of what the Kingsleys tried to pull. Some board meetings you walk away from feeling like you've lost something important. This one felt like I'd finally won something that actually mattered. Family court at 9 a.m. on a Monday felt like the world's most depressing board meeting, except instead of discussing quarterly projections and market penetration strategies, we were litigating whether locking an 8-year-old outside in sub-zero weather constituted child endangerment. The Cook County Courthouse had that particular blend of institutional beige and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look like they were attending a shareholders meeting for a company that was about to declare bankruptcy. Judge Patricia Martinelli presided over courtroom 4B with the kind of no-nonsense authority that reminded me of the best venture capitalists I'd worked with. Sharp, direct, completely unimpressed by wealth or status, focused exclusively on the fundamentals. She'd been handling family court cases for 15 years, according to Priya's research, with a particular reputation for prioritizing child welfare over parental convenience or family reputation management. I sat at the petitioner's table with Priya, who looked like she'd stepped out of a corporate law firm's recruitment brochure, tailored navy suit, leather briefcase full of meticulously organized documentation, the kind of professional presence that screamed, "I bill $500 an hour and earn every penny." Behind us sat Kara Velasquez from DCFS, her tablet loaded with the kind of detailed case notes that would make any compliance officer proud. Across the aisle, Aurora sat with her attorney, Michael Chun, who'd built his practice representing high-net-worth individuals in complex domestic situations. Chun was good. I'd actually referred clients to him back when I thought family law was something that happened to other people. Aurora looked like she hadn't slept since Thanksgiving, wearing a black pantsuit that made her look more like she was attending a funeral than a custody hearing. At the respondents' table, Maureen and Gerald flanked their attorney, Patricia Knowles, who specialized in crisis management for wealthy families facing public scandals. Knowles had the kind of reputation that came with defending politicians and corporate executives when their personal lives became front-page news. She probably charged more per hour than most people made in a month, and her client list read like a who's who of Chicago's financial elite. Judge Martinelli called the hearing to order with the efficiency of a CEO opening a board meeting. "We're here for Emergency Custody Petition 2024, FC 8847, Hale versus Hale. Counsel, I've reviewed the filings. This appears to be a straightforward child endangerment case with some unusual family dynamics." Priya stood up, her opening statement as precise as a Series A term sheet. "Your Honor, this petition concerns documented child endangerment that occurred on November 25th at the Winnetka residence of Gerald and Maureen Kingsley. The respondents locked petitioner's 8-year-old son outside in 5-degree weather for over 5 hours, resulting in medical symptoms consistent with early-stage hypothermia." She pulled out a tablet and began walking through our evidence like she was presenting due diligence findings to a skeptical investor. Exhibit A: photographs documenting the child's condition upon discovery. Exhibit B: Weather Service data confirming temperature and wind chill. Exhibit C: medical evaluation from Dr. Elizabeth Nguyen documenting physical symptoms. Exhibit D: DCFS incident report and initial findings. Judge Martinelli reviewed each exhibit with the kind of methodical attention that reminded me of investors examining financial statements for red flags. Her expression grew increasingly grim as she worked through the documentation, particularly when she reached Dr. Nguyen's medical report. "Ms. Knowles," the judge said, looking across at the Kingsley's attorney, "I'm hoping you have some compelling explanation for why your clients felt that sub-zero exposure was an appropriate disciplinary measure." Knowles stood up, clearly recognizing that she was defending the corporate equivalent of insider trading. Technically possible, but morally indefensible. "Your Honor, my clients maintain that this was a brief timeout that was extended due to miscommunication. They had no intention of endangering the child and deeply regret any distress this situation may have caused." "Miscommunication," Judge Martinelli repeated, her tone suggesting she'd heard more convincing explanations from tax evaders. "For over 5 hours. In weather conditions that posed documented risk of frostbite and hypothermia." Gerald started to stand up, probably thinking he could negotiate his way out of this like it was a hostile acquisition, but Knowles quickly gestured for him to sit down. "Smart move. Family court judges don't typically appreciate unsolicited input from defendants who think child endangerment is a manageable public relations crisis." "Your Honor," Chin said, rising to address the court on Aurora's behalf, "my client acknowledges that serious errors in judgment occurred. She's prepared to enter into a voluntary agreement for supervised visitation and family therapy pending resolution of underlying issues." Judge Martinelli turned her attention to Aurora, studying her with the kind of focused assessment that venture capitalists used when evaluating founder competency. "Mrs. Hale, you're an attorney yourself, correct? You understand the legal implications of child endangerment." Aurora's voice was barely audible when she replied, "Yes, Your Honor." "And you were present when your son was locked outside?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Did you attempt to intervene or bring him inside?" The silence stretched out like a liquidity crisis. Aurora's face went through several expressions before she finally answered, "No, Your Honor. I should have, but I didn't." That admission hit the courtroom like insider trading evidence in an SEC investigation. Judge Martinelli made notes on her legal pad, while Knowles probably calculated how much this was going to cost her clients in reputation damage and legal fees. Dr. Nguyen. Judge Martinelli called, looking toward the back of the courtroom where our pediatrician sat ready to testify. Can you summarize your medical findings? Dr. Nguyen approached the witness stand with the kind of professional demeanor that made me grateful we'd built a relationship with her through 3 years of Theo's regular checkups. She was the kind of physician who treated medicine like engineering, precise, evidence-based, completely unimpressed by wealth or status. The child presented with symptoms consistent with prolonged cold exposure, she testified, referring to her notes like she was presenting clinical trial data. Skin pallor, decreased core temperature, early signs of frostnip on fingers and ears. Additionally, I documented older bruising on his arms and legs that suggests a pattern of physical discipline. The older bruising comment sent a visible shock through the courtroom. Gerald's face went white as a quarterly loss report, and Maureen looked like she'd just discovered that her investment portfolio had been built on fraudulent assets. In your professional opinion, Judge Martinelli asked, was this child in immediate physical danger? Yes, Dr. Nguyen replied without hesitation. Continued exposure in those conditions could have resulted in serious frostbite, hypothermia, or worse. The fact that he maintained consciousness and core body temperature is fortunate, not inevitable. Judge Martinelli reviewed her notes one more time, her expression suggesting she'd reached the kind of definitive conclusion that ended board meetings and sealed corporate fates. Based on the evidence presented, she said, I'm granting the petitioner's request for emergency temporary custody. The child will remain with Mr. Hale pending further proceedings. Mrs. Hale will have supervised visitation twice weekly, contingent on enrollment in family therapy and parenting classes. She turned her attention to the Kingsley's table, her voice taking on the kind of authoritative tone that made corporate executives nervous. Mr. and Mrs. Kingsley, you will have no unsupervised contact with the child until this court determines that you pose no risk to his welfare. I'm also ordering a full DCFS investigation into your household and any other minor children who may have been exposed to similar treatment. The gavel came down with the finality of a market close, officially restructuring our family dynamics under court supervision. Gerald looked like he'd just watched his empire get acquired by hostile investors, while Maureen appeared to be calculating the reputational damage to their social standing. As we filed out of the courtroom, I felt the kind of satisfaction that came from successfully defending against a hostile takeover. Theo was safe, the legal framework was in place, and anyone who wanted to challenge our new family structure would have to go through the courts. Sometimes the best acquisitions are the ones where you gain control of the only asset that really matters. A week after the custody hearing, our Series B officially closed at a $45 million valuation, which should have felt like the kind of milestone that warranted champagne and celebratory dinners at $48,000 venues. Instead, I was sitting in Lexford's conference room overlooking the Chicago River, explaining to our board of directors why their CEO had spent the past week in family court instead of focusing on scaling our legal tech platform to capture market share before competitors moved in. The board meeting felt different this time. Usually, these sessions were all about growth metrics, customer acquisition costs, and runway optimization. The standard venture capital theater where everyone pretended that hockey stick projections were actually achievable if you just threw enough machine learning algorithms at contract compliance problems. Today, there was an underlying tension that reminded me of damage control sessions after a data breach or regulatory investigation. Sarah Hoffman, our lead investor from Beacon Ventures, opened the discussion with the kind of diplomatic directness that made her one of the most successful Series B specialists in the Midwest. Marcus, we're obviously supportive of your family situation, but we need to understand any potential impact on company operations or market positioning. I looked around the table at the people who'd bet their funds' capital on my ability to revolutionize legal technology. Tom Chun from Azure Capital, whose portfolio included 3 unicorn startups and who'd personally written the largest check in our funding round. Elena Rodriguez from Techstars, who'd been tracking our progress since we were operating out of my garage. David Park, our independent board member, who'd built and sold 2 legal tech companies before joining us as an advisor. Fair question. I said, pulling up the quarterly metrics on the conference room monitor. Our customer retention rate is 94%. We've closed 3 enterprise deals in the past month, and our AI accuracy scores are outperforming every competitor in the contract analysis space. The family situation hasn't impacted company performance. If anything, it's reinforced why our mission matters. Tom leaned forward, his expression carrying the kind of focused intensity that venture capitalists deployed when they sense potential liability exposure. How so? We build systems that protect people, I replied, thinking about the systematic approach I'd use to document Theo's endangerment and build an evidentiary case that would hold up under legal scrutiny. Compliance protocols, risk assessment, evidence preservation. That's exactly what I've been living for the past week. Our technology exists to catch the problems that human oversight misses. I just applied those same principles to protect my son. Sarah nodded, making notes on her tablet. The board voted unanimously to support your position. What we need to know is whether there's any ongoing risk to the business from family-related litigation or reputation issues. I'd been expecting this question, and I'd prepared for it the same way I prepared for due diligence sessions. Comprehensive documentation, clear risk assessment, multiple scenario planning. The legal situation is contained, I said, pulling up the custody timeline that Priya had developed. Temporary custody orders are in place. DCFS investigation supports our position, and any attempts at retaliation will be handled through existing legal channels. What about Aurora's family? Elena asked. The Kingsleys have significant business connections in Chicago. Any risk of them targeting LexForge or our client relationships? That question hit at the heart of what I'd been planning since the custody hearing. Gerald and Maureen weren't the type to accept defeat gracefully. They'd spent decades using financial leverage and social pressure to get their way. But I'd learned something important during my years building LexForge. Sometimes the best defense against hostile actors is to remove their ability to operate from positions of strength. Actually, I said, feeling the kind of strategic satisfaction that came from executing a perfectly timed market move, I think their business focus is going to be elsewhere for the foreseeable future. I pulled up my phone and scrolled to the text conversation I'd been having with Naomi Carter at Alder Rock Capital, one of the most aggressive private equity firms in the Midwest. Naomi specialized in acquiring family-owned logistics companies and optimizing them through operational restructuring and management changes. Gerald's logistics empire has some interesting vulnerabilities, I continued, thinking about the 3 phone calls I'd made after the custody hearing. Turns out, when you spend decades intimidating suppliers and treating employees like disposable assets, it creates the kind of operational inefficiencies that attract private equity attention. Tom's eyebrows went up. You're targeting his business? I'm not targeting anything, I said, which was technically true. I simply made some introductions to people who specialize in identifying undervalued logistics companies that could benefit from better governance and worker protections. The first call had been to Jake Morrison at Summit Ventures, who'd been circling Gerald's company for months, but hadn't found the right entry point. I'd mentioned, casually, during a conversation about supply chain management and legal tech, that Kingsley Logistics might be facing some leadership transitions that could create acquisition opportunities. The second call had been to Naomi at Alder Rock, who had a reputation for acquiring companies with problematic management structures and implementing what she called accountability-based restructuring. When I'd mentioned that Kingsley Logistics had potential governance issues that might benefit from professional oversight, she'd immediately started running preliminary valuations. The third call had been to Martinez and Associates, a compliance consulting firm that specialized in investigating workplace safety violations and labor law enforcement. When they'd asked for referrals to companies that might benefit from proactive compliance audits, Kingsley Logistics had seemed like a natural fit. Within 48 hours of making those introductions, I continued, Gerald received 2 acquisition offers and a notification that the Department of Labor was conducting a routine inspection of his worker safety protocols. David Park, who'd been through several acquisition scenarios during his career, was nodding with what looked like professional appreciation. And faced with external pressure from multiple directions, he took the deal. I finished. Clean acquisition by Alder Rock, contingent on implementing worker protections, governance reforms, and, most importantly, The immediate termination of Maureen's consulting contract, which had been paying her $200,000 annually for what appeared to be strategic advice, but looked suspiciously like self-dealing when examined by actual financial analysts. Sarah was taking detailed notes, probably calculating the strategic implications of having a CEO who could neutralize business threats through market manipulation. So the Kingsleys are no longer in a position to retaliate against LexForge. Gerald's spending his time explaining to new management why his previous employee retention rates were so terrible, I said. Maureen's dealing with the IRS audit that Alder-Rock's due diligence team discovered regarding her consulting payments. And both of them are too busy with their own compliance issues to worry about our family situation. The board exchanged looks that suggested they were recalibrating their assessment of my strategic capabilities. Elena was the first to speak. That's comprehensive. It's systematic risk management, I replied. The same approach we use for protecting our clients' contract portfolios. Identify threats, assess vulnerabilities, implement countermeasures, monitor results. Tom leaned back in his chair, wearing the kind of expression that venture capitalists got when they realized their investment was in better hands than they'd initially thought. And Aurora? How is she handling the restructuring? That was the question I'd been dreading, because unlike Gerald and Maureen's business empire, Aurora's situation wasn't something I could fix through strategic market moves. She's starting therapy, I said, both individual and family counseling. She's also taking a leave of absence from her law firm to focus on meeting the court's requirements for supervised visitation. That's got to be difficult, Sarah said, and I could hear genuine sympathy in her voice. Giving up partner track at a boutique firm. She's not giving it up, I clarified. She's postponing it. The firm's being supportive. They understand that family crises happen, and they value her long-term potential more than short-term billable hours. Which was mostly true. Aurora's managing partner had been surprisingly understanding when she'd explained the situation, probably because the alternative was having a family court scandal associated with their corporate law practice. They'd structured her leave as a sabbatical for personal development, which would look better on her resume than suspended pending resolution of child endangerment investigation. So where does this leave us operationally? Elena asked, bringing the conversation back to business fundamentals. I pulled up our quarterly projections, feeling the familiar satisfaction of reviewing metrics that actually mattered. Series B funding gives us 18 months of runway to scale nationally. We've got pilot programs launching with 3AM Law 100 firms in Q1. Our machine learning accuracy is outperforming every competitor, and our customer acquisition costs are dropping as word-of-mouth referrals increase. And personally, David asked, how are you managing single parenthood and CEO responsibilities? I thought about Theo, who was currently at school learning Python programming in his computer science class and asking questions about artificial intelligence that most adults couldn't answer. The kid was thriving with the kind of stability and predictability that apparently came from living with a parent who prioritized his safety over social appearance management. Theo's doing great, I said. Better than great, actually. Turns out, kids flourish when they don't have to worry about being locked outside for burning dinner rolls. The board meeting ended with unanimous approval of our strategic direction and a renewal of confidence in my leadership, which felt like the kind of validation that actually meant something. Not because they approved of my family decisions, but because they recognized that the same systematic thinking that made LexForge successful could also be applied to protecting the people I cared about. Some acquisitions are about gaining market share. Others are about removing threats to your core assets. And sometimes, the most important restructuring you can do is making sure your family operates according to principles that actually matter. By April, Theo had the kind of color in his face that came from spending weekends at Lincoln Park Zoo instead of locked outside in sub-zero weather conditions. The kid was thriving in ways that reminded me why I'd started LexForge in the first place, to build systems that actually protected people instead of just managing appearances. He'd joined the robotics team at school, was learning Python programming with the same intensity that most 8-year-olds reserved for video games, and had started asking questions about machine learning algorithms that would have impressed our Series B investors. Dad, do you think AI could help kids who can't fight for themselves? He asked one Saturday morning while we were debugging code together in my home office. He was sitting cross-legged on the floor with his laptop, working through a tutorial on natural language processing that was probably more advanced than what most college computer science majors tackled. The question hit me harder than I'd expected, partly because it was so clearly his way of processing what had happened with the Kingsleys, and partly because it was exactly the kind of systems thinking that suggested he might actually understand what we were building at LexForge better than some of our board members. "That's a really smart question," I said, saving the compliance algorithm I'd been reviewing and giving him my full attention. "What made you think about it?" "Well," he said, his fingers hovering over the keyboard like he was trying to formulate a complex legal argument. "If computers can read contracts and find problems that people miss, maybe they could read other stuff too, like reports about kids, or messages, or patterns that show when adults aren't being safe." Jesus. The kid was basically describing predictive analytics for child welfare, which was probably a billion-dollar market opportunity if someone could figure out how to implement it without creating a surveillance state. More importantly, he was thinking about technology as a tool for protection rather than profit, which suggested I was doing something right as a parent. "That's exactly right," I said. "And actually, some people are already working on systems like that, using AI to identify patterns that might indicate when kids are in dangerous situations. We've been having conversations like this more frequently since the custody situation stabilized. Theo had started talking about maybe studying engineering in college, and then maybe law school later, for litigation that helps kids who can't fight for themselves. The combination of technical skills and legal advocacy was exactly the kind of interdisciplinary thinking that the next generation of legal technology would require. Our weekends had developed a rhythm that felt sustainable in ways that our previous family dynamics never had. We'd take the Tesla to campus tours at Northwestern and UChicago, talking about engineering programs and computer science departments like they were potential investment opportunities. We'd fly commercial when we traveled. No more private jet expectations or $48,000 venue requirements. Just normal family experiences that didn't require leveraging our Series B funding for lifestyle inflation. The financial restructuring had worked exactly as planned. Theo's education trust was generating solid returns in a diversified portfolio that would cover undergraduate and graduate school regardless of market volatility. Our monthly expenses had dropped significantly without the Kingsley family's influence pushing us toward luxury lifestyle, signaling that nobody actually needed. It turned out that happiness had a much lower burn rate than I'd previously calculated. On a warm evening in late April, my phone buzzed with a text from Aurora. "Finished my compliance plan with Dr. Peterson. Judge Martinelli approved expanded visitation. Can I come by for dinner tonight?" I'd been expecting this message for weeks. Aurora had been methodically working through the court-mandated therapy requirements with the same systematic approach she'd once used for complex corporate transactions. Individual counseling twice weekly, family therapy sessions focused on boundary setting and child advocacy, parenting classes that covered everything from age-appropriate discipline to recognizing signs of emotional manipulation. The supervised visitations had been going well, awkward at first, like board meetings between former business partners who'd had a falling out, but gradually becoming more natural as Aurora learned to prioritize Theo's emotional safety over family diplomacy. She'd started asking him direct questions about his feelings and experiences instead of managing everyone else's expectations about what family relationships should look like. "What do you think?" I asked Theo, showing him the text message like I was presenting a potential acquisition proposal for his consideration. He looked up from his laptop, where he'd been working through a coding challenge that involved building a simple AI chatbot. "Is she different now?" "What do you mean?" "Before, she always seemed like she was worried about making Grandma and Grandpa mad," he said, with the kind of perceptive honesty that reminded me why 8-year-olds sometimes understood family dynamics better than the adults who created them. "Is she worried about making me safe now instead?" That was probably the most sophisticated risk assessment I'd heard all week, including the ones from our compliance team. "I think she's learning to be," I said. "Dr. Peterson says it takes time to change old patterns, especially when you've spent your whole life trying to make other people happy instead of doing what's right. Like debugging code," Theo said. "You have to find all the problems before the program works correctly." "Exactly like debugging code." I texted Aurora back. "Yes. Dinner at 6:30. Theo's request. homemade pizza, and no burned rolls jokes. She arrived at 6:15, carrying grocery bags and wearing jeans and a Northwestern Law sweatshirt instead of the designer outfits that had been standard during her Kingsley family performance era. She looked smaller somehow, more honest, like someone who'd finally stopped trying to manage a public image that had never actually fit. "Hey," she said when I opened the door, and her smile looked genuine for the first time in months. "I brought ingredients for pizza dough. Figured it was time I learned how to cook without burning the house down." Theo appeared in the hallway, studying his mother with the same analytical attention he used for debugging complex algorithms. "Did you learn about setting boundaries?" he asked, like he was confirming that she'd successfully completed a software update. Aurora knelt down to his eye level, her expression serious in the way that suggested she'd been practicing this conversation with Dr. Peterson. "I learned that my job is to keep you safe, even if that makes other people unhappy. And I'm sorry I forgot that before." "Okay," Theo said, apparently satisfied with her compliance certification. "Want to see the chatbot I'm building? It uses natural language processing to identify emotional patterns in text." As they headed toward the living room, Aurora caught my eye over Theo's head. "I signed the updated parenting plan with Chun," she said quietly. 50-50 custody contingent on continued therapy and court approval. No unsupervised contact with my parents until they complete their own family counseling program, which they would never do because Gerald and Maureen were too busy dealing with the operational restructuring at Kingsley Logistics and the IRS investigation into Maureen's consulting contract to focus on acknowledging their parenting failures. But that was their choice to make. We made pizza dough from scratch, and Aurora only burned one batch of breadsticks, which Theo declared acceptable kitchen learning outcomes, with the kind of technical precision that made me proud of his systematic thinking. We talked about his robotics team, her therapy progress, and LexForge's expansion into new markets for legal AI applications. After dinner, we sat on the couch while Theo demonstrated his chatbot, which was surprisingly sophisticated for something an 8-year-old had built using online tutorials and sheer determination. Aurora asked intelligent questions about the machine learning components, and I could see her starting to understand why our son was so excited about the intersection of technology and social justice. "Dad," Theo said when Aurora was getting ready to leave, "what did you whisper to the police officer that night, besides the 6 words about calling CPS?" I looked at Aurora, who nodded like she was ready to hear whatever truth I'd been carrying since Thanksgiving. "I told Officer Hart that this wasn't about punishment or revenge," I said. "I told her this was a restructuring, not of money or business relationships, but of our family, to make sure the most important person in our portfolio was actually protected." Theo considered this with the same analytical approach he used for complex coding problems. "Good," he said finally. "We needed a better operating system." After Aurora left, I tucked the bottle of Macallan 25 back on the top shelf of the kitchen cabinet. Some whiskey you save for celebrating successful Series B funding rounds or major client acquisitions. But the really good stuff, that's for moments when you realize you've successfully debugged the most important algorithm in your life. The family restructuring was complete. New governance protocols, improved risk management, better allocation of resources toward assets that actually mattered. And for the first time since I'd started LexForge, the metrics that counted most weren't about market share or customer acquisition costs. They were about making sure an 8-year-old genius felt safe enough to ask big questions about using technology to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. Which, when you really thought about it, was exactly the kind of mission-driven business model that led to sustainable long-term growth.